Hello, welcome to the Midnight Dark. Subscribe US for more videos. The beckoning static. In 1987, a radio tower was built 200 miles from the nearest town in the Nevada desert. For 3 decades, it broadcast nothing but static. Until last month, when rescue teams found the remains of 23 people surrounding its base. All had walked hundreds of miles through deadly terrain to reach it. And the strangest part? The tower had been abandoned for over a year. Eerie electronic hum builds. What you're about to hear is the recovered audio log of maintenance engineer Sarah Chen, the last person to visit Tower Echo 7 alive. This is her story. The GPS died exactly 47 miles from the tower. Sarah Chen had been expecting it. Company policy warned all technicians that electronic equipment malfunctioned in the Echo 7 vicinity. What she hadn't expected was the way her skin began to crawl as soon as the screen went black, as if something had been watching her through the device and had now turned its full attention to her unprotected flesh. She pulled her company truck to a stop on what barely qualified as a road, 2 tire tracks carved through hardpan desert that hadn't seen rain in 8 months. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through the sparse Joshua trees that dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels. Sarah had been a radio tower maintenance engineer for 12 years. She'd climbed structures in blizzards, during electrical storms, and in desert heat that could kill an unprepared person in hours. She wasn't easily spooked. But Tower Echo 7 had a reputation among the tech crews, and not a good one. The tower had been built in 1987 as part of a classified government communications project. Officially, it was designed to provide backup emergency broadcast capabilities for the western United States. Unofficially, the rumors ranged from alien contact experiments to psychological warfare research. What everyone agreed on was that the assignment was cursed. In 34 years of operation, Echo 7 had gone through 47 different maintenance technicians. Most quit after a single visit. A few had suffered mysterious accidents on site. 3 had simply disappeared, their vehicles found empty at the tower's base with no sign of struggle or explanation. Sarah had volunteered for the Echo 7 assignment 6 months ago, driven by a combination of professional pride and financial desperation. The hazard pay was triple standard rates, and she needed the money for her mother's cancer treatments. The company had been honest about the risks, psychological stress, equipment failures, and an unusually high rate of what they euphemistically called personnel incidents. What they hadn't mentioned was the dreams. For the past 3 weeks, Sarah had been experiencing vivid nightmares about the desert. Not the familiar, sun-baked landscape she knew from her waking visits to Echo 7, but a twisted version where the sky was the color of old blood and the Joshua trees moved with malevolent purpose. In these dreams, she was always walking toward the tower, unable to stop or change direction, while a voice that sounded like radio static whispered instructions in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The dreams had started affecting her work performance and her relationship with her boyfriend Marcus. She'd begun sleeping with the radio on, finding that background noise helped suppress the nightmares. But even during waking hours, she found herself unconsciously humming a melody that seemed to come from nowhere, a haunting, atonal progression that made her teeth ache. Now, standing in the desert heat with the tower visible as a black needle against the horizon, Sarah realized she was humming that same tune. She forced herself to stop, but the melody continued in her mind, as if it had taken root in some deeper part of her consciousness. The walk to the tower took 45 minutes across terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and spirits in equal measure. Sarah's boots crunched through crystalline formations that looked like salt but tasted metallic when the wind blew them into her mouth. The Joshua trees grew more twisted, and now as she approached the tower, their branches reaching toward the sky in configurations that hurt to look at directly. Tower Echo 7 rose 400 feet into the cloudless sky, its steel framework painted a flat black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The structure was older than most towers Sarah had worked on, built with techniques and materials that had been obsolete for decades. Strange modifications had been added over the years, dish arrays pointed at angles that made no sense for conventional broadcasting, and cables that disappeared into sealed junction boxes covered in warnings written in multiple languages. The equipment shed at the tower's base was where Sarah was supposed to conduct her monthly maintenance check. Company records showed that the tower had been broadcasting nothing but static for the past 3 years, ever since the last classified project had been terminated. Her job was to verify that the transmission equipment was functioning properly and to replace any failed components. But as Sarah approached the shed, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The door was standing open, and she could hear the faint sound of music coming from inside. Not the static she'd been expecting, but an actual melody, the same haunting tune that had been plaguing her dreams. Inside the shed, banks of vintage radio equipment hummed with activity. Analog meters danced behind glass faces, and vacuum tubes glowed with an amber light that cast twisted shadows on the concrete walls. Everything appeared to be functioning normally, except for the music. The melody was coming from an old reel-to-reel tape recorder that, according to her schematics, shouldn't have been connected to anything. The machine was playing a loop of music that seemed to shift and change even as she listened, starting as something almost beautiful before gradually becoming discordant and wrong. Sarah's training told her to shut down the unauthorized equipment and file a report. But something deeper, some instinct that had kept her alive during her years of dangerous work, told her to leave immediately. The rational part of her mind noted that her hands were shaking and her heart rate was elevated for no apparent reason. The irrational part whispered that she was in mortal danger and needed to run. Instead, she did what she'd been paid to do. She opened her toolkit and began conducting the standard maintenance procedures, checking connections and testing equipment function. But as she worked, the music from the tape recorder began to affect her in ways that defy explanation. The melody seemed to resonate with something in her bones, creating harmonics that she could feel as much as hear. Her vision began to blur at the edges, and she found herself seeing movement in her peripheral vision that vanished when she turned to look directly. The temperature in the shed dropped noticeably, despite the blazing desert heat outside. It was while testing the main transmission array that Sarah discovered the recordings. Hidden in a maintenance log that hadn't been updated in over 2 years, she found references to audio files stored on the system's backup drives. The files were labeled with dates and times, but no other identifying information. Against her better judgment, Sarah accessed the first file. The recording was of a man's voice, calm and professional despite the terror in his words. Day 4 at Echo 7. The static has changed. It's not random anymore, there's a pattern, like Morse code but more complex. I've been trying to decode it, but every time I think I'm close to understanding, my nose starts bleeding and I have to stop. The company says the tower is just a backup transmitter, but I found blueprints in the old files that show it was designed for something called Project Deep Listen. Whatever that means, I don't think we should be broadcasting it. Sarah accessed the next file, recorded 3 days later by the same voice, now strained and fearful. The pattern in the static is a language. I'm sure of it now. It's trying to teach me something, but every lesson comes with a price. My dreams are full of impossible geometries and cities that exist in frequencies our eyes can't perceive. I can feel something listening from the other side of the signal, waiting for someone to complete the transmission. The final recording was nearly unintelligible, the man's voice broken and desperate. It's not broadcasting to us. We're broadcasting to it. 34 years of static, but we've been sending a signal to something that lives in the spaces between radio waves. And now it's ready to respond. God help us, it's ready to come true. Sarah's hands were trembling as she shut off the playback. The tape recorder in the corner had gone silent, but she could still hear the melody in her mind, stronger now and accompanied by harmonics that seemed to come from the very air around her. Outside, the desert had changed. The sun was setting, though Sarah's watch insisted it was only mid-afternoon. The Joshua trees had moved closer to the tower, their twisted branches now clearly reaching toward the transmission array at the structure's peak. And in the distance, barely visible in the growing twilight, shapes were moving across the desert floor. Sarah grabbed her emergency radio and tried to call for pickup, but got only static in response. Not random static, the patterned, musical static that was apparently Echo 7's true broadcast. As she listened, she began to recognize elements of the melody that had been haunting her dreams. The shapes in the distance were getting closer, and Sarah realized they were people. Dozens of them, walking in perfect single file toward the tower. Men and women of all ages, moving with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers. Their clothes were torn and sun-bleached, suggesting they'd been walking for days or weeks across the brutal desert. But it was their faces that made Sarah's blood freeze. They were smiling. All of them wore identical expressions of beatific joy, as if they were approaching something wonderful rather than a radio tower in the middle of nowhere. Sarah ran for her truck, but the engine wouldn't start. The electrical system was completely dead, as if something had drained every amp of power from the battery. She was trapped, with nightfall approaching and dozens of people shambling toward the tower with expressions of religious ecstasy. She climbed. The tower's maintenance ladder was rusty and treacherous, but it was her only option. As she ascended, she could hear the approaching crowd below, their voices raised in a wordless harmony that matched the melody from her dreams. The sound was beautiful and terrible, a human chorus performing music that human throats were never meant to produce. From the tower's peak, Sarah could see the full scope of what was happening. The walking people weren't the only ones coming. In every direction, more figures emerged from the desert, all converging on Echo 7 with the same purposeful stride. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, drawn by a signal that had been broadcasting for over 3 decades. As the crowd gathered at the tower's base, they began to arrange themselves in geometric patterns that hurt Sarah's eyes to look at directly. Their harmonious singing grew louder and more complex, adding layers and frequencies that seemed to originate from somewhere other than human vocal cords. The transmission equipment began to respond. Arrays that had been dormant for years sparked to life, and the tower itself began to vibrate with electromagnetic energy. Sarah could feel her hair standing on end and taste copper in the air. That's when she realized the horrible truth. The people below weren't victims of the tower's broadcast. They were part of it. Each human voice added to the signal's complexity, turning Echo 7 from a simple radio transmitter into something far more sophisticated, a device for communicating with intelligences that existed in dimensions parallel to our own. The static had never been random. It had been an invitation, broadcast for 34 years until enough people received it and understood its purpose. Now they were here to complete the conversation, to open a doorway between worlds that should never have been connected. Sarah pulled out her pocket recorder and began documenting what she was seeing, knowing that someone needed to understand what had happened at Echo 7. As she spoke, the singing below reached a crescendo that made the tower sway despite its massive steel construction. The sky began to tear. Not metaphorically, but literally, reality ripped open above the tower like fabric, revealing something beyond that human perception could barely process. Shapes that might have been alive poured through the opening, drawn by decades of static song and the willing sacrifice of hundreds of human voices. In her final recording, Sarah's voice was calm despite the chaos erupting around her. If you're hearing this, stay away from Tower Echo 7. Destroy it if you can. The signal has to be stopped before more people hear it. Before more people understand what it's really saying. The static isn't trying to communicate with us. It's trying to change us into something that can survive what's coming true. The recording ends there. When the search team found Sarah's body 3 days later, she was at the tower's base among the others, her face wearing the same expression of peaceful joy. Her pocket recorder was still running, but the rest of the tape contained only static. Beautiful, patterned static that several team members found strangely compelling. The tower was demolished 6 months later, but by then it was too late. The signal had evolved, spreading to other transmission stations across the country. And in quiet towns and cities, people were beginning to dream of walking through the desert, following the sound of music that promised answers to questions humanity was never meant to ask. The static is still broadcasting. It's just using different towers now. And if you listen carefully to the radio late at night, when the signal conditions are just right, you might hear it too. A melody that seems familiar, like something from a half-remembered dream. Don't try to decode it. Don't try to understand. Just turn off the radio and walk away. Some invitations are too dangerous to accept. Static builds to crescendo, then cuts to silence. Tower Echo 7 was officially destroyed, but the frequency it discovered remains active. Government agencies monitor it constantly, but they can't shut it down. Because the signal isn't coming from Earth anymore. It's coming from somewhere else, calling to anyone with the right kind of mind to hear it. The question isn't whether you'll hear the static. The question is, will you be able to resist answering when it calls your name? Faint static resumes, then fades.